What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, we're going to be breaking down everything that you need to know about seed starting mix. What makes a good one? Which one should you go with? And are there any shortcuts you can take to save a little money? Let's go. All right, so when picking out the ideal seed starting mix, there's a few things you want to look at. Now, when it comes to picking out the seed starting mix that's going to work best for you, you have to first look at the components of what makes up a seed starting mix. And there are three components that make up basically any seed starting mix you're going to go with. The first thing you have to ask yourself is, are you going to go with a soilless mix or a compost-based mix? And that really makes the biggest difference of them all. If you go with a soilless mix, you're going to be going with something that has a base of sphagnum peat moss. Peat moss is basically just, it's blended up sphagnum moss, but it's not broken down yet. So it acts like a soil, but it is technically soilless. There's no compost, there's no humus, there's nothing really organic material about this. And so it gives you the benefits of longevity. It's not gonna break down like a soil-based, compost-based blend would, but it also holds on to water, it acts the same way, and it really is void of any of the things that come in compost, like mold, mildew, fungus gnats. Those things can all come in a soil-based or compost-based blend, which is why a lot of people typically go with a soilless blend. That's the biggest difference between a soilless and a soil-based compost. I do have a soil-based potting mix here. This has some forest floor humus mixed in, and you'll notice a huge difference. You'll notice the color, a big difference. Much darker. It does have some sphagnum peat moss in there, but there's compost also added. And that compost, it adds a really rich, organic, fertile smell. It is beautiful. But again, with the fact that there's compost in there, you do run the risk of having things like mold and mildew because compost is a living, breathing thing. And that's why a lot of gardeners, if they're growing indoors for seed starting purposes, you typically want to go with a soilless blend, because if something does happen, if your soil does get too wet or stays too wet for too long, or if there's things like fungus gnats that come in, those pests, when left unchecked, can really run rampant. And so, in my personal opinion, the ideal mix is going to be one that is soilless. But the purpose of giving you both is that you might find that a soil-based or compost-based mix is something that you'd like to go with. So I just want to give you those two options. The next component of the seed starting mix is going to be the drainage component. And that comes in with perlite. Now, perlite is an expanded volcanic rock. It's really lightweight. And a lot of people think this little white stuff is styrofoam. Now, it's not styrofoam. It almost acts like styrofoam because it'll float. If you throw it in water, it'll float. And it's so lightweight that basically all this does is it acts as a kind of a placeholder where compost would normally be, but it actually kind of fills a void, and it allows water to kind of drain around this little volcanic rock kind of pebble, if you will. Now, it's so lightweight that you can literally just crush it. It just crushes like nothing. And that's awesome because it doesn't add weight to your seed starting mix. It actually makes it lighter, but it also increases the drainage. Compare that to something like sand. A lot of people will add sand to their seed starting mixes. Sand is very dense, it's very heavy, and because it's not expanded, it doesn't really increase the drainage as much as a perlite does, but it also adds a lot of unnecessary weight. So I love to go with perlite. Now, the size of the perlite does matter. It's really important that you get the right size perlite. This sunshine mix here that we have has a combination of what's called ultra-fine and fine perlite. Now, you can get into what's called a medium grade, a coarse grade, or even an extra coarse grade of perlite. But in my personal opinion, if you're going with the ideal seed starting mix, for most applications, I prefer a fine and sometimes even adding in a little bit of ultra fine. This sunshine mix, as you can see, has that combination. It's about a 50-50 blend of ultra fine and fine. The ultra fine looks like almost like little flakes of snow versus the fine looks more like little almost like hail. It's like little hail pebbles there. And so having that combination allows for fluffiness, really lightweight fluffiness, and then the fine grade perlite allows for that really good drainage. If you go too large on the perlite, you're going to find that it's really going to mess up your seed starting experience. If you're starting in small containers like this, where the cells are only like a ½ inch to maybe an inch wide at most, if you throw an extra coarse grain of perlite in there, you're going to find that these are basically going to be filled up with that perlite, and you won't have any room left for the actual moisture holding capabilities, which is the stuff you want, because that's the stuff that the roots are going to penetrate into and grow with. All right, so we talked about a soilless versus a soil-based mix. We talked about perlite, and now I want to talk about the third component to any seed starting mix, or the ideal seed starting mix, and that is vermiculite. Now, vermiculite is an expanded volcanic rock, much like perlite. However, how it differs is that it actually is porous. Now, perlite is not porous. Perlite does not have any pores for the water to actually penetrate in, and so it doesn't really hold on to anything. That's why it works really good for drainage. However, you want something that is slightly porous so that it holds on to not only a little bit more water, but also nutrients. And that's the big thing that vermiculite kind of helps you do in the ideal seed starting mix. Without it, what will happen is if you add like a organic fertilizer or some worm castings or whatever you're using for your nutrient source, which we'll get into, your seed starting mix is going to drain, and it will always drain. And regardless if you're going with a big container or a small container like this, as you water, the nutrients will get flushed out of the soil. And so having that vermiculite is really critical to holding on to that, onto those nutrients close to the plant roots, where your plant roots are actually going to be utilizing it. So with that being said, there are also there's ultra fine, fine, medium coarse, and extra coarse grades of vermiculite, just like perlite. And in my opinion, the ideal size to go with, if you're getting like a sunshine mix, something that's like an all-in-one mix, it's already going to have that added. But if you're making it yourself, you can buy all these components in bulk and mix it yourself for really cheap. But you want to make sure that you go with like a fine grade vermiculite as well. You can go with a medium grade or a large grade, but there are downsides to that. Again, primarily just in the bulkiness of the mix. If it's too bulky, it's really going to just kind of be chunky and clumpy, and it's going to be hard to work with. So I prefer a fine grade vermiculite, or going with something like the Sunshine Mix or a Pro Mix, which already has it kind of incorporated in there. So now let's talk about nutrients. All right, so now it comes to the most important part in my opinion, which is the nutrients component. And that's because you're going with a soilless mix and not a soil-based or compost-based mix, you don't have any nutrients. That is one of the trade-offs of going with a soilless mix. So it's really important that you supplement those nutrients. It's almost like a little multivitamin for your seed starting mix. You got to take your little Flintstones vitamin and throw it in the soil, otherwise your plants are going to be they're going to be deprived and void of those nutrients, which is what they use to grow. So we're going to take in this 5-gallon bucket here, we have it filled about 50%. I'm going to take about 2 tablespoons of worm castings, and they go a really long way. Then I'm going to take about a handful of trifecta. You don't need that much. It's about a 1/4 cup. And that's going to go in there. And now I'm just going to blend this in. Super important you blend it in, and I'm also going to add some water to pre-moisten this, because you want it to, if you don't pre-moisten it, it's kind of going to all settle around. So I'm going to pre-moisten this so it kind of sticks together and clumps together, and that is the ideal seed starting mix. You have the nutrients, which is what your plants are going to grow with. You have the perlite, which helps to add that drainage and that fluffiness, that aeration you're looking for. You have the moisture holding capabilities, that bulk of the peat moss, and then you also have the nutrient holding capabilities of the vermiculite. And all of those combined with the right size of them, the right particle size, the right percentages of them, and things like that, all of that plays into making one of the most ideal seed starting mixes that you're going to find. So one thing you'll notice when I'm pre-moistening this, the water doesn't just beat up and become a puddle. It absorbs really quickly into this mix. And that tells you that you have the right consistency. If you find that you're adding water to your mix and the mix is actually just floating on top of the water and the water is down in the bottom of the bucket, you definitely have to make sure that you add more perlite and more vermiculite, and also even maybe consider adding a little bit of dolomitic lime, because what can happen is if you're going with a peat-based blend and it isn't something that is a pre-blended mix, like if you're making it yourself and you're getting just a big block of peat moss, it has not been amended with dolomitic lime, which actually helps to increase the the moisture holding capability. It almost activates, if you will, the peat moss. But you'll notice when you put your seed starting mix into these cells here, you shouldn't have any really large chunks. And so if you're finding that there's really large chunks of, say, perlite, vermiculite, obviously downgrade the coarseness a little bit. If you're finding that your peat moss is really chunky and is kind of creating these big chunks and hunks of peat moss, try sifting it. If you go with a forest blend, you're going to end up with way more because you have inevitably a forest blend is just decomposed wood chips and stuff like that. All right, so there you go. There is how to make an ideal seed starting mix. Regardless if you're making it yourself or you're buying a pre-made mix, the biggest thing is just understanding those three components and how they interact with your plants and what makes an ideal mix. And also the final thing I was gonna end on is a lot of people get hung up on brands. Like this year we're going with a sunshine mix, but we also will probably at some point go with a pro mix. We've used both, we love both, and that leads a lot of people to ask me, well, how come you don't have a favorite brand? Or like, what brand is best for me? The nice thing is the fact that once you understand those three components and what makes an ideal mix, brand to brand, there's nuanced differences. There's really not that big of a difference between the sunshine mix and the pro mix and things like that. And you will get people that are brand loyal and they just have like an absolute cult following appreciation for a certain brand. But when it comes to me, I've had great results with literally any brand because what it comes down to is the components, and those make up the biggest difference of a seed starting mix. So I'll just simply look at it. If it's got the perlite and the right size perlite that I like, if it's got the vermiculite and the right size vermiculite that I like, it's a soilless blend, it's been amended with some of that dolomitic lime to help the absorption, and it's a pre-sifted mix, it's like that's what I look for, that's what I go with. Doesn't matter the brand. I just pick it up and I start growing with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a thumbs up there. Subscribe if you haven't already. We have tons more videos coming out, one of which is the next one we're gonna film, which is 5 seed starting mistakes you don't wanna make. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. Yeah, we'll catch you all later on the next episode. All right, take care guys. As always, remember to grow big or go home. See ya.